At the base of all human reality, dictating how we process every piece of information we encounter, lies a single bedrock question: who judges whom? The modern, secular world operates on a hidden, unexamined premise. It assumes that autonomous human reason sits on the throne as the sovereign criterion. This assumption makes man the absolute measure of reality. Every external input, every moral claim, and every spiritual concept is forced to pass through the filter of human logic. This diagram illustrates what happens when human logic is pushed to its absolute limits to map absolute metaphysical truth. The light of finite reason cannot illuminate an infinite grid. Its beams are structurally bent inward, resulting in a tangled, localized knot. When the intellect attempts to validate its own foundations, using its own internal rules, it encounters the problem of self-reference. Without an external anchor, the mind enters an infinite regress, where every justification requires another justification, eventually collapsing into a closed loop. Finite human logic operates within strict structural boundaries. It is exceptionally good at measuring the physical, observable world, but it cannot transcend its own architecture. In philosophy, this limitation is recognized as the Kantian ceiling, the built-in inability of reason to establish absolute truth independently. When finite reason attempts to rule over the infinite, it hits a mechanical dead end. It defaults into circular logic, infinite regress, and paralyzing skepticism. This scale maps the absolute epistemological ultimatum we face. Reason and revelation cannot exist in perfect neutral balance. One side aggressively tips. Either revelation weighs and judges reason, or reason weighs and judges revelation. Resolving this conflict requires a total systemic reversal of epistemological gravity. The idea of intellectual neutrality is an illusion. The human mind must either force the divine text into submission or willingly be subjugated by it. The solution begins with what we call the metacognitive pivot. This is the exact moment the intellect recognizes its own structural boundaries. Instead of attempting to calculate the infinite, the intellect executes a specific, conscious action. It willingly steps off the throne of absolute judgment. This spatial map shows the replacement. Furqān, divine revelation, descends from above as an unyielding external standard, pulling the center of gravity outside the human subject. Watch the tangled knot of self-reference snap to a straight vertical axis, ordered by a single fixed point. This shift in gravity completely reorders how a seeker approaches ta'wil, the science of interpretation. Without this extremal criterion holding the structure together, interpreting reality becomes unmoored, exposing the seeker to severe mathematical and spiritual dangers. The first major hazard in interpretation occurs in the heart, often triggered by profound spiritual openings and deep personal intuition. This occurs specifically at the station known as Nafs al-Mulhama, the inspired soul. Cautionary tone. The classical sources warn against heavily relying on personal intuition at this stage, absent a definitive external criterion. This flowchart tracks the mechanism of failure. When divine text passes through an unanchored node of personal intuition, the output distorts outward into lawless syncretism. The seeker begins reading their own subjective desires back into the divine text. This leads to the false conclusion that all spiritual paths are equal, forcing the strict parameters of revelation to bend and accommodate personal feeling. When subjective spiritual experience operates above the text, the seeker effectively turns their own self into a false idol. The parallel hazard exists in the mind. Allowing rationalism to govern interpretation introduces an equally lethal structural flaw. We map this rationalist deception as the Mutazilite trap. This timeline tracks the trap. First, human reason serves beneath revelation. Next, it moves laterally, building a filter to accept only what logic independently verifies. Finally, reason elevates itself to the top, casting a shadow downward to judge revelation itself. The ultimate outcome of this trap is an inversion of the court. Revelation is forced to stand as a defendant before the tribunal of human reason. Rationalism in interpretation inevitably usurps and overwrites the very divine text it claims to study. Al-Furqān provides the definitive solution, correcting the fatal drift of both the inspired soul and the rationalizing mind. This physical, historical reality of the divine text demands a highly structured approach to interpretation. The Quran self-identifies as the active separator between absolute truth and falsehood. It functions as the definitive edge that clarifies the boundary where human speculation ends. This corrected hierarchy establishes an unbreakable orthodox rule. Experience, intuition, and reason must always be strictly judged by the Quran and Sunnah. The critical inverse is enforced by an impenetrable barrier. Revelation is never to be judged by human faculties. This strict hierarchy provides a firewall against lawless syncretism. Fixing the standard outside the self prevents reshaping by personal preference. True interpretation only becomes possible when human nodes unconditionally subordinate to the divine input. This brings us to the exact divine intention behind the word al-Furqān. The intention is a rescue operation. It pulls the human mind from the chaos of self-reference, where morality and identity dissolve into mere preference and projection. We define this physical and conceptual act as post-deliberative entrustment. This ultimate structural surrender acknowledges a concrete reality. The word of Allah sits enthroned far above the finite human skull. Adopting an objective anchor from outside the human self is the only mechanical way to break the paralyzing loop of modern skepticism. We arrive at a final paradox. Kneeling before revelation is not the death of the intellect. This epistemological surrender actually serves as the intellect's proper coronation. It cures the mind of its arrogant delusion. The intellect stops trying to act as the false sun by which the Quran is judged. With its sight corrected, the intellect takes its proper place. It operates as a brilliant lamp held firmly in the hand of divine revelation, providing clarity and light while remaining subordinate to the hand that guides it. Human reason finds its true power and exact purpose only when it accepts its role as an instrument of the criterion, rather than its master.